Hey, we're on, for those of you new here today, we're on week 10 of our Old Testament survey. And we've got, if you look over on the wall, you can see we've added, or Bruce has added, the divided kingdom with 2 pipes. We'll talk about all that. There's some little doodads on the pipes, which are all the kings and 1 queen. And put some prophets in there. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go down all the way to the end of that pipe. And there's 2 boots at the end because they got the boot out of the land. So that's why those boots are there, okay? There's also 1 pink stopper on the bottom because there is 1 queen of the southern kingdom also. And we'll talk about her in a little bit. Okay, while you're all standing, everyone asks, why do we do this every week? The reason we do this every week to go through the walkthrough, 1 is so you'll learn it, and 2, because there's a test on week 14, and we're going to just draw random names out of a hat, and then you guys can come up. No, I'm kidding. But I may ask Randy to do it, since, Randy will train. Okay, let's start, all right? We start over here, creation. Remember the first one? We start down here and we go creation, the fall, the flood, nations, all right? And then we come down here. This is Egypt, right? You got the Red Sea. Go ahead and sit down. I'm sorry while we're doing that. The Sinai Peninsula, the Persian Gulf. We get here and we dip our finger in it. It's what?
I'm going to do.
Salt. And it's
myself, tell the story.
Era. Okay. They come up Tigris, Euphrates, up the Euphrates River to Haran. Haran is what? Barren, like Sarah. Abrahamic covenant. LSB, what is it? Seed, blessing. All right. Terah dies. They go to the promised land. In the promised land, Abram has 2 sons, and they're 2 eyes, right? So who are they? Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac has 2 sons, J and E, smooth and hairy, right? They are? Jacob and Esau. Jacob has how many sons? 12. And 1 daughter? Is who? Dinah, okay. The son we're interested in, coat of many colors, is Joseph. Thrown in a cistern, sold to Midianite traders. They come to the land of Egypt. In Egypt, he works for a guy named Potiphar, right? Potiphar. Thrown in jail, rises second command, the vizier in Egypt to Pharaoh. There's a famine in the land. Israel comes to the land. And then there's how many years? 400 years of bondage. At the end of that time, we have a mighty deliverer who is Moses. Moses says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no. 10 plagues. Right? They leave, cross the Red Sea, go to the Sinai Peninsula. They come to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, they're given a couple of things, right? Which are, right? The tablets, the law, and the instructions for the tabernacle. Then they come up to a place called Kadesh Barnea. At Kadesh Barnea, they send out 12 spies. Remember, this is 12 because I'm counting my earlobes, right? So 12 spies, all right? 10 say no. 2 say, go. And who are the 2? Joshua and Caleb. All right. Because of that, all those 20 and under, they sentenced to Rome. That generation dies out. They come to the east side of the Jordan River, right, to a mountain called, remember? Nebo. All right. Everyone's got a knee. Everyone's got, yeah, okay. Nebo. All right. At Nebo, or in this area, Moses gives 5 sermons contained in the book of Deuteronomy. Reminds all of those folks what they got at Sinai. All right, Moses dies, new deliverer, General Joshua, right? Joshua crosses the Jordan River with all of the Israelites. They go across, they take the battle, the battle of what? Jericho, and then Ai. Then they go south, clear the land, north. Not totally of all of them, but that's how they did it, all right? Then, once in the land, Joshua then divides the land into 12 pieces, at the end of which Joshua dies, and then we have 400 years of the Dark Ages, right? Of judges. During that time, you have judges. At the end of the 400 years, there are close to it, there rises the last judge and the first prophet of Israel, a man named Samuel. And he anoints 2 kings, right? He anoints Saul first. Saul was tall, handsome, judged by the outside to become the king, all right? And then he anointed the second one, which was David, okay? And then, of course, David's son Solomon followed. So you had 120 years of united monarchy over there. And we talked about Saul had no heart, David had whole heart, and Solomon had half heart. Because Solomon, at the end of his reign, got into idolatry. He started out great, but he fell off at the end. He falls off at the end, and then what happens? His son, over here, if you take a look, there's a big axe. We have that axe there to represent the splitting of the kingdom. And there's also 2 bombs hanging down there. Remember the bombs because you'll remember the names of the 2 kings. So, Jerry and Ray. If you remember Jerry and Ray, and just add the bombs, you got them, all right? Jeroboam and Rehoboam, okay? So, the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, is the king of the northern kingdom. He does some things because what he does not want to do. Oh, I should back up because they split over taxes. Bruce kind of talked about that last time. Rehoboam did not listen to the elders. He listened to some buddies of his. And so he said, I'm going to tax you harder than my dad. And because of that, boom, they split. 10 tribes go north, 2 tribes go south. Okay? Judah and Benjamin stay south. The other 10 go north. Jeroboam, what he does in order to consolidate his kingdom, he does not want all the Israelites marching down to Jerusalem to the temple to worship God. So what does he do? He sets up 2 temples, one at Dan and one in Bethel. So Bethel is pretty close to Jerusalem. It's on the way, so people from the north would stop and they would worship there. Not only that, but he created his own priesthood, his own festivals, and all of that. So what he did was he made a religion that looked a lot like the Israelite religion, but it was not. Jeroboam was also offered by God to say, hey, if you follow me and you hold to all that I've given to David and you follow all of the laws, he says, I'll make a great and mighty nation out of you also. He didn't do it. And because of that, he fell. All right, so basically in this, what we learn here is that the big thing here is that didn't ask Jeroboam how to worship him. He asked Jeroboam whether he was going to worship him. He already told him how. We already know how to worship, God. The key is are you going to make that choice? Jeroboam did not make it. And if you look at the subsequent books as you go through Kings and Chronicles and all, you'll see that all the subsequent kings of the northern kingdom were all compared to Jeroboam. They said it was just like the first king. You followed evil. 19 kings in the north. How many good kings in the north? 0. 19 and 0. That's the score of the north. In the south, how many kings in the south? There were 19 kings and there was 1 queen. So there are actually 20 monarchies during that. And how many good ones? Anyone know? 8. There were 8. Okay? And if you go over there, and you can see the good kings are represented by the corks. And the bad kings are represented by the little colored, what's that, plungers? Toilet plungers, that's right, I forgot that. Okay, the toilet plungers, okay? And there is 1 pink one there, and that pink one is an interesting story. That pink one belongs to a queen who is called Athaliah, all right? Athaliah, I don't know if you know the story, but Athaliah was related to Ahab and Jezebel of the north. And you'll see all in the history of the Israelites, if you couldn't get at them through warfare, if you couldn't go straight on and take them on head on, what you do is you get them through the local culture and normally through the women. So they would intermarry. If you look at the history of the north with Ahab and Jezebel, they were very, very evil. And what had happened was Jehoshaphat and Ahab had become somewhat friends. They had joined forces to fight with each other, not with each other, but for each other. And what had happened in order to cement that is they had married off Athaliah, their daughter, down to the southern kingdom. When she came down to the southern kingdom, she married a king named Jehoram, and what happened was immediately the first thing he did after he married her was to kill all his brothers. which is what happened in the north. That's how they did it, right? So I'm going to kill everyone who could take the throne from me, all right? So I solidify my throne. In this case, she came down, so the first thing they do in the southern kingdom, boom, he kills all his brothers. All right, and then through some things that happen in the south, or in the southern kingdom, Athaliah actually becomes queen. When she becomes queen, do you know the first thing she did? Anybody know? She killed all of the Davidic offspring that she could find. So she tried to find everyone who was related to David, who was a descendant who could possibly take that throne, all right, and she killed them. But she missed one. Did someone say who she missed? Actually, Joash, right? Yeah. And Joash was 1 year old, and he was saved by a young lady in the palace, took him and hid him in the temple for 6 years. At the age of 7, then, they bring him out of hiding, and he becomes the king of Judah, all right? And Athaliah is deposed at that point. The moral of that whole story is that as you take a look at that, in the covenants, Messiah was to come from the line of David. He was to be from that line. So if you could eliminate that thread, that line, all right, you eliminate that thread of Messiah. And so it's such a great story because it's a story in there, but when you take a look at the whole thing, it's God again. His salvation plan that started way back there, that thread continues. It was never broken. In the southern kingdom, that thread continued. There was a bloodline from the very beginning, Rehoboam, all the way to the end. In the northern kingdom, not so. So God preserved that remnant. Can you imagine if Joash would have been one of them that were killed? Then what would we have, right? So you never know anything that you do for God, even in a corrupt culture, that there's still faithful people who take action and to preserve the salvation that God's going to bring. Such a great story. There's a lot of those stories in here, and there's so many years there, it's very difficult. But what happens at the end of the northern kingdom, they were prophesied to go, right? So in 722, boom, they get to boot. Assyria comes and takes them. Assyria takes them out of the land, and that's where they call the 10 lost tribes, because we don't really have a record of what happened to all of them, all right? And then in Samaria, all that's left is kind of the dregs of the land, and then the Sumerians come in, they settle people there. That's why some of the animosity between the Jews of the southern kingdom and Samaria. And in the southern kingdom, it goes all the way to the end of 586 when Babylonia comes in and gives them the boot. Actually, there was 3 deportations. The first one started in 605, all right, and that's probably when David was taken, and that's when the clock started for the 70 years of captivity. Here. What's that? Or Daniel, I'm sorry. I said David. Yeah, Daniel was taken, and the other princes. That was the date of his captivity to Babylonia. In Babylonia, they spent 70 years of captivity, which is where we'll end, and we'll talk about that next week. So we do have a special speaker, so I'm going to get off the stage so he can come in and fill you in a little bit more on the prophets.
Check, cash, credit, debit, check. Am I on? Okay, hey, hi, welcome to the 17th annual Sons of the Prophets orientation ceremony. My name is Shamar, and I'm here to, orient you and stuff. So, okay, listen, I'm just going to be straight up with you guys. I'm not prepared to speak today. And I don't know, you're probably all just sitting there wondering, where's Elisha? I thought we were going to hear from Elisha. Well, you were. He was ready to come up here and give you a life-changing speech on profiteering and everything like that. But when we were outside waiting to come in, this messenger from King Jehu showed up and was mumbling all this crazy business about assassination and treachery and all this other stuff. So Elisha's gone. And you get me instead, the backup. So, even though I just wanted you to rest assured, though, because, like, even though I didn't do, like, a lot of formal preparation for this speech, like, my whole life has been preparing me for this speech. Like, it's all in here and in here. Hopefully going to come out of here. So, where to begin? History, right? Like, you're all here because you want to join our group, the Sons of the Prophets. And just so you know, like, we've gone by a lot of different names over the years. Some people have called us, like, the Sons of the Prophets is, like, the most common one, but that can be a little bit confusing because we're not, like, biologically the Sons of the Prophets, you know what I'm saying? Same with, like, Band of the Prophets. People have called us Band of the Prophets, but hardly any of us play instruments. We're not the Band of the Prophets. And weirdest name of all is Cadre of the Prophets. I read that one a little while ago. I was like, what even is a cadre? Like, sounds like that French guy that tried to sell my sister-in-law furniture a few months ago. Cadre, no way, I say. But basically what our group is we are a fellowship of men who are devoted to God and devoted to learning from his prophets, like 100%. And we believe that the rest of Israel should live that way too, you know? So that's what we do. We're kind of like a mixture, I would say, of like the prophetic fan club and like the prophets volunteer staff. You know, we help them do their thing. And our first leader was Elijah. You've probably heard of him. But he went roaring off into retirement a few years ago in this fiery chariot. And so then Elisha started wearing his coat, doing his thing. And so Elisha is our leader now. And let me tell you, like, Elisha, I'm so bummed you guys can't hear from him today because he is like a boss with a capital B. I got to share just 2 quick Elisha stories, probably because he's not here right now. But like the first time I ever spoke to Elisha, like, you know, face to face, it was like 6 or 7 years ago. And me and some of my buddies from the Sons of the Prophets, we were out chopping wood next to this little lake. And I was going to town on this one beefy log. It was an awesome piece of wood, just huge, long and round, like a massive woody bean burrito or something. And I was just chopping like a maniac when all of a sudden, whoosh, my axe head went flying off my axe and go whoo, 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 right past my buddy's head, splashes into the middle of the lake. And my buddy was like, bro, you just almost killed me. And I was like, dude, who cares? That axe head was borrowed. Like, I am so dead right now. My neighbor's going to kill me. And we just started going back and forth a little bit. And we didn't even notice that Elisha, he walks up and he's just all chill and serene. And he just is like, relax, guys, I got this. And he takes this stick that he had in his hand, and he just throws the stick out into the middle of the lake, and it splashes right by my axe head. We were all quiet for a minute, and I looked at him, then I looked at the stick, and I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. Like, he's making me feel like less of an idiot by throwing something of his own out into the middle of the lake. Okay, I can dig it. But then I heard my buddy next to me gasp, and I look out there. Floating on the surface of the water, right next to the stick, was my iron axe head. Now, I'm no physics major, you know, that's not my thing, but I know stuff like that does not happen every day. It was crazy. And so Elisha looks at us just standing there with our mouths open, and he goes, go out and get it. So I did. I swam right out there, grabbed my axe head, put it back on the axe, and just, you know, kept getting after it. It's incredible. Okay, the other Elisha story, this one is just as cool. It was like a few years after that, and it was at our Sons of the Prophets picnic that we do every year. And one of my bonehead friends, he had found these wild gourds growing out in this field. And he was like, hey, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make some wild gourd stew. Which sounds like a great idea. However, these were like gourds of death and pain. You know, they were all poisonous, and we'd had like 3 or 4 bowls apiece, and before long, we're all lying on the ground, flopping around and groaning like a bunch of sweaty manatees giving birth or something. It was horrible. And like, my stomach is a cast iron pot. Like, I can pretty much eat anything, and it's not going to do anything to me. So like, if you knew that stew made me sick, that's some pretty raunchy stew. So we're all lying there, but once again, Elisha just walks up, like he's got everything under control, takes a little bit of flour out of his pocket, sprinkles it into that pot of stew, gives us all a few more spoonfuls, and just like that, we're all better. Incredible. Now, I can see all you newbies right now looking at me with like your big eyes and stuff. I want to make something really clear. Okay, the prophets, men like Elijah and Elisha, they're not just like magic men with, spooky powers and laser eyes, okay? Like the reason that God gives men like Elisha and Elijah the power to do all this crazy stuff like float axe heads, cure the world's worst food poisoning, the reason he does that is because he wants people to know that they can trust these guys as his messengers. It's all about the message, not the magic. The same is true for like when they make predictions. Because a lot of people think that prophets are all like about telling the future. They got their little crystal ball. They're just going to tell you everything that's going to happen. No. I mean, most of what the prophets say is not about what's going to happen. Most of what prophets say is about what's happening right now. And a lot of times when they do make a prediction, it's so that they can be proven that they really are God's messengers. Okay, so that's like really important to remember. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of yahoos out there who are running around saying that they're prophets of God, and they really are not. I call them non-prophets. Like, I even had a buddy once tell me he was going to give money to a non-profit organization. I was like, dude, don't do it. That's messed up, man. Keep your money. They're not really prophets. So, yeah, so that is the first thing that I really want all you greenhorns out there to remember is this. Being a prophet is not all about the miracles or the predictions. It's about the message. And most times, you're telling a message that people don't want to hear. If you haven't noticed, like, our nation of Israel is in really, really bad shape right now. Like, the kingdoms are torn in two. Both sides hate each other. Foreign invaders are like trying to take us over all the time. And like, there's idols everywhere, which is even the worst part of it. And so, I mean, being a prophet in an environment like this, it's hostile. People aren't going to want to listen. They're going to hate you. It's like you're a doctor who's having to tell people all the time that they're just about to kick the bucket, or a sports reporter for the Mariners or something like that. It's like, it is not a job that you can do if you aren't prepared to be boiled alive or sawn in two or have little kids make fun of your male pattern baldness, which it happens. Ask Elisha about that one. Not cool. So anyways, maybe you're wondering like, why I think the nation's going down the toilet? Because I'll tell you, I think it's the kings we've had. They've just been horrible. Because if you haven't noticed, it doesn't take a lot of qualifications to be king. You pretty much just happen to have the right genes, or you can kill everybody else who has the right genes. So because of that, we've just had bad king after bad king after bad king, and when the leaders are egotistical jerks, or when they're worshiping idols, or when they're ruthless killers, pretty much all the nation's just going to fall in line behind them. Because the people are only as good as their leaders, and most of the leaders we've had have been losers. So, boy, that's the task that we're faced with. You guys think that you're up to this challenge? You think that you can live the prophet life? Because that's where we come in when the leaders fail. We are like the conscience of the nation. We are like that little voice in the back of your head you sometimes hear during dinner time that's like, Shamar, don't eat that 7th fig cake. You're going to regret it when you're running out of the tent 10 times tonight, That's like what we are for the nation of Israel. And 99 times out of 100, it's a message people don't want to hear. We remind the people of the promises they've made to God and the promises God has made to them. So you think you can do it? You think you can hang with bros like me and Elisha and be social rejects for the rest of your life? Because if you think that you are, you're probably not ready for this. But whatever, we'll see what happens, right? It's only your first day. So now, it is my pleasure to welcome our next keynote speaker for the day, who's here to get you all pumped up on prophecy. That is Bruce the Moose Stabbert. So let's all put our hands on our head, give him the traditional Bruce Moose welcome. Bruce! Bruce!
Oh my goodness. Oh, help us. Oh. Okay, take a deep breath. This is not a wig. We have moved from the golden age to that. It's the divided kingdom. Basically, it's actually a little longer even than the Dark Ages, and it's got a lot of the same qualities, only it has kings, which the period of the Judges did not. But I'm more concerned about this, that there are similarities between this perilous time period that we're highlighting today and our own times. I don't like saying that, but I think that we can't stick our head in the sand and pretend that civilization as we know it is in any kind of golden age either. Even here in America, if I can get very serious, things are on the decline with no immediate signs of recovery. And you know it, our country's past was far more connected to a belief in the Bible and a respect for Jesus Christ as the Son of God, with beliefs that came with that, a moral code that is no longer in play in today's culture. And I don't have time in this short message to give you a stack of statistics to prove this decline, and you can see it yourself. I certainly don't want you to take my comments as some kind of a political thing, like having one party in power or another makes really any difference. I'm talking about the spiritual temperature of a nation. And it has moved into the danger zone by all measures that I know about. This is reality for those of us who love Jesus and also love our country. We are increasingly aware that we are strangers and outsiders in our own land. Our land has more and more boldly sold its soul to false gods, gods of power and pleasure and the lust for individual prosperity. Now in Israel, that meant a slide toward judgment. Going down the drain is the symbol that we're using in the timeline. So we have drain pipes there. And each evil king is depicted by a little toilet plunger that is just making the drain run faster toward the day when they will get the boot. The northern kingdom, usually called Israel, was defeated and deported by Assyria, as we've heard. This was 722, so you'll see on the boot over there, if you go look at the timeline a little closer, it has 722A on it, which is sort of like a boot size, but that's a big boot. And it booted them so far, they never came back. Now, the southern kingdom, which we usually call Judah, which also included another tribe called Benjamin, was defeated and deported by Babylon about 130 years later, and so thus the B on the second boot, 586B, not quite as big. They came back, so that kind of helps you a little bit. And A and B, kind of a alphabetical order. Have you heard of that? That's really helpful to me. You can even remember the date when all that started. The division took place in 931. 9 divided by 3 is 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 931, that's the date when the divided kingdom began. Now, the history of the Northern Confederacy, called Israel, 10 tribes, sometimes called Ephraim, sometimes called even Samaria, it is one of unabated idolatry, over and over, doing the same idolatrous things. There is a run of 19 kings in 9 different dynasties. They're all evil. The throne is stained by bloody assassinations, sins of every kind, especially rank raw idolatry. It is to these northern tribes that Elijah and Elisha come, the most powerful prophets, the first troublers of Israel, to use Ahab's word. And so they're sent there, and later Hosea and Amos sound warnings of judgment there, even Jonah. Assyria then deports the Jews of the northern kingdom. The narrator stops and tells us why. And this is in 2 Kings 17. If you want to turn there, this is one of the times when the narrator just gives you a summary of how it all turned out. And I'm not going to read all of this, but here are some of the things that, well, this won't surprise you, that God would have to judge a nation like this. It says this occurred, and when it talks about the fall of Israel and the A722 or 722A, this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. This is what we called Canaanization in a previous message. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. That's pretty straight language. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. Down in verse 13, yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. That's the generation that said no when it was time to enter the land before the wilderness wanderings. Go down to verse 16. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. This is something that Jeroboam did at the very beginning of the Northern Confederacy. And they made an Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal or Baal. And they burned their sons and daughters as offerings and used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. And then down at the bottom in verse 23, so Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day, at the time when this was written. Wow. Now, God had determined to judge them from the very beginning of that kingdom when Jeroboam was on the throne, and yet he waited 200 years before that actually happened. Now, things are only somewhat better in the south. In the southern kingdom of Judah, it's just one dynasty, a result of God's faithfulness to David. 19 sons, grandsons of David occupy the throne of Judah, plus the one queen that we've heard about, Athaliah. And Ahab, she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which meant she was probably not very great herself, and she was not. But Ahab gets the black plunger over here because he was the worst king that either of these kingdoms ever had. Now, there's a big difference, as Don was pointing out. Of those 20 rulers in Judah, 8 of them are good. Covers 60% of the time frame from 931 to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Now, we depicted their reigns with little corks, because good kings tend to hold back the rush toward judgment. So the little corks sitting in the sewer pipe didn't hold it back completely, as we know. Now, that is why the southern branch, of course, gets an extra 130 years before exile. The 2 best kings were Hezekiah and Josiah. To just give a little more history, they were known for their trust of God, and especially Josiah for his devotion to the law, which was discovered in the temple when they were making repairs. The worst king in the south is the long-reigning, violent Manasseh. Happened to be Hezekiah, a good king, happened to be his son. He was the grandfather of Josiah. But he, as the king, sacrifices his son on an altar, practices witchcraft, and it is based on his record of evil, 55 years' reign, that God just said, it is enough, I have to judge Judah as well. In spite of the intervening reign of Josiah, in fact, it is Josiah's sinful sons who preside over the final collapse of Judah. Now, here, I'm caught there, okay. Here's what I'm interested in for our souls this morning, and it's the very reason we should read this section of the Bible, which covers 1st and 2nd Kings, 2nd Kings mainly, 1st and 2nd Kings, and the book of 2nd Chronicles. These chapters move from one king to the next, kind of back and forth between the north and the south. Now, what we get a picture of is frustrating decline. But as we observe this decline with a certain amount of sadness, we also see that there are pockets of faithful believers who are living their lives as pure and as joyful as possible. Many of these are prophets, as we've heard, but there's also housemaids and widows soldiers, nurses, ordinary people who really believe God. Technical term you might want to learn for this is the word remnant. And here's what God told Elijah when Elijah felt that he was the last warrior left standing. 1 Kings 19:18. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, meaning 7,000 will not be judged for being disloyal to Yahweh, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Now the deal is, here is where we fit into this. This is precisely what we are within our own times. If we follow God, we live by his word in an idolatrous post-Christian culture, then we too are the remnant. We're a minority. We are the faithful few. And we too are the nurses and widows and soldiers and housemaids. And perhaps all of us are called to be prophets in our culture. And we face the same questions they did. How do we survive as a scorned minority? How do we honor God when most of our neighbors are lighting it up for their chosen idol? How do we keep being outspoken believers in a post-God society? And is it possible that most of our children and grandchildren will be swept away by the tide of popular, mindless, reckless, moral apathy and anarchy? Which is just a long way of saying, what's going to happen to our kids? As things are bad and perhaps are getting worse. And I think and I pray about this every day. Because I'm a dad. Because I'm a pastor. I'm a citizen. I'm a believer in Jesus, and this matters. Now here's what I want to distill from these many chapters. I want us to see some clues that help us in this battle to maintain faith in a faithless world, to stand as a remnant in some kind of bold and continuing way that will bring honor to God. Now, the first clue comes from the events that led to the fracture in the first place. If you retrace your steps back to Solomon, who was the third king of the United Monarchy, God gave him extra majesty beyond what Saul or David had. But Solomon, in spite of his great wisdom that he's known for, he asked for it, he prayed for it as a young man. He ended up making some very unwise, foolish, ungodly choices. And so this big-headed king had a love problem. He loved many foreign women, especially the daughter of Pharaoh. And his wife, 700 of them, plus 300 concubines, plus 1,000 mothers-in-law, turned his heart away after other gods. I mean, that's just plain. The evil, however, invited the anger of God. He became half-hearted when he let himself be double-minded. You see how those always go together? You lose half your heart and it goes to the other part, double-minded. That's how it works. So his father David had cautioned him to serve God with his whole heart, or God would not be with him. There would be disaster. When, well, it says he did not fully follow the Lord as his father David had done. He built high places for idols to please his lovely wives, but at the cost of displeasing his wonderful, jealous God. And so we have the fateful 1 Kings 11, where God announces to half-hearted, double-minded Solomon that the kingdom will be ripped away. So let me read 2 or 3 verses from that chapter, and this is another one you want to mark as a place where the narrator gives you the full picture. And here in 1 Kings 11, we have this said to Solomon. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. His servant would be Jeroboam. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son, Rehoboam. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son. Actually, it ended up being 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So God disciplines Solomon by allowing his servant to rise up and take 10 tribes away. Jeroboam actually builds golden calves to aid in the worship of God away from the temple that is now controlled by Judah and Jerusalem. So, the temple, was not particularly portable. But golden calves again? And then using the same old chant, Israel, behold your gods who brought you out of Egypt? Now let's start into these clues. Here's one, and this just comes from Solomon himself. Recognize the dangerous seductions of status and pleasure. Don't underestimate their power to seduce you. This would come if you were overestimating your ability to stand against bad stuff that's around you. And Solomon definitely did that. Maybe he just felt like he's got a momentum here, and he presumed that whatever had been promised to David was just going to automatically come to him, even if he flirted with idolatry and married all these foreign wives. But anyway, remember what Paul said, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So I'm just going to start with this. If someone as wise as Solomon can trip up this bad during perilous times and lots of pressures on you, it could happen to you. Now, I counsel you to do something that you learn when you get down to Josiah, the boy king. He became king at 8 years old. By the time he was 18, that's when they discovered the law, and he cleaned out the land in repentance to reading what Moses had given them from the book of the covenant. And he had a faithful heart toward God, and that's why the kingdom was extended even as long as it was. And so what I want to say in regard to this is don't underestimate the power of the Bible to establish you. I truly believe that it's the people and the churches that neglect the Bible that are going to be swept away as times get harder, when the remnant is going to have to stand. Now, there's a second clue I want you to think about, and it has to do with just whether or not God is in control. Because when you get into hard times and when situations change where it's more and more obvious that a remnant's going to have to stand up for God, you might think that things are just sweeping out of control. But I can tell you there's nothing going on in our day that is the slightest surprise to God. And that's a blessing when you think, oh, well, I've got to stand, but does God really have anything to do with this? All you got to do is look at the stories where God knew, for instance, that a widow needed food for her son and sent a prophet to her, and then they ate. They had oil and meal and all of that perpetually because God was looking after his remnant. I could say much more about that from these stories, but I want to go on to something else. You can get kind of mechanistic about how you think God treats people during this time, that God somehow can bless this kind of person, but he can't bless that kind, and you kind of try to read God's mind of what his attitude is, because obviously evil gets you to 722A and 586B, so bad people get treated like this. But I want you to think a little more subtly about this. Not that God is morally ambivalent, but I will tell you, for instance, you're trying to stand up, and part of the remnant, let's say you blow it, you lose your courage. Something happens, and you're thinking, okay, then I'm toast. That's it. And my point is that God has not given up on you when you're going through these times. And I say that because of the details of the history. God in mercy, in fact, extends a delay in judgment for 2 centuries, even to the northern evil kingdom that didn't even have one good king. Or you can look at 2 Kings 14, and this blew my mind when I reviewed this. And I've forgotten I'd ever seen this. Maybe I'm just not a very good reader. But look at this. This is Jeroboam II, not even related to Jeroboam I, but he comes later in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah. Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, that's the northern kingdom, and he reigned 41 years, long reign. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that's the first Jeremiah, which he had made Israel to sin. Now listen to this. He restored the border of Israel and now he gives you some dimensions. And actually, the borders are increasing under his reign. You say, well, what's going on with that? And in fact, it says, in the way that God's servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was from Gath-Hepher, had predicted. That's our Jonah. This is the only place Jonah is ever mentioned in the Bible, except in the book of Jonah. And then it says, for the Lord saw that the affliction of Israel was very bitter, for there was none left, bond or free, and there was none to help Israel. This is Israel, bad Israel, northern Israel. But the Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, so he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. Evil Jeroboam, he's using him to save people in the north. Now, we could go to other things to demonstrate this. Consider that God called some of the kings in the south good when they really had not cleaned up all the high places. Think about the fact that God, in immense grace, kept on sending prophets to these people, north and south. Men and women who sounded warnings and called for change and pled with them to go forward with God. And so I want you to go with this clue, if I can kind of say it in this way for those of us of the modern remnant. Rely on God's grace to sustain you even after you've disappointed him. I mean, God could have dumped this whole cotton-picking line of kings, north and south, but he did for them what my dad actually did for me one time. I won't tell you about this because, and I wrote this down so I could just get the facts straight, but one day my friend Steve Bueller and I were engaged in a friendly rock fight. It was over on 53rd Street. I could take you to the house with the big tree where Steve had climbed. I was pelting him with small stones from the gutter, sort of like Shimei persecuting David. He wanted to come down, but I kept him treed until I heard some glass smash. I had missed Steve, and I hit something that didn't sound good. I didn't wait for Steve. I ran like the Dickens down the alley. One block, and I was safe at home. I caught my breath and went to the kitchen for some toast. I forgot all about the tinkling glass. Thinking back, I guess I didn't care if Steve got tagged for it. A half hour passes, maybe an hour. Through the lace curtains, I spot a large TPD officer. For those listening, that's Tacoma Police Department. Coming down the sidewalk, badge flashing, followed by a long line of neighborhood people. He turns up our steps and knocks hard. At first, I have no idea this could possibly be about me. Is this where Bruce lives? My dad has answered the door, and I'm peering around the corner of the kitchen. Just as it dawns on me that my rock has boomeranged on me. And now, with all my heart, I wish my dad would say, no, I've never heard of such a wayward and evil child with such a silly name. You've got the wrong house. But, of course, my dad is no liar. As the story goes, according to the man in blue, my little insignificant rock had struck a window where an infant was sleeping, and the glass shards had peppered the crib. And someone with the title Mommy was a tad bit upset, enough to call in the law. And someone with the title Stevie Iscariot was ticked enough to finger his buddy Bruce and lead the officers to the culprit's home. Thankfully, he omitted the betrayer's kiss. And now they wanted to know my side of the story, and my dad calmly let me answer, which I did as truthfully as I could. I'm glad to report that my dad didn't disown me, quickly changed my last name and claim I was a relative from Minnesota who had overstayed his welcome anyway. Haul him away. For certain, my dad was ashamed of me and embarrassed to be related to an idiot. But he never let go of my shoulder. He never let anyone hurt me back. He walked with me all the way back to the scene of the crime, and he held my hand all the way. Surrounded as we were by all the nosy and condemning neighbors, he was bearing my shame with me. And he stood by me when I asked the forgiveness of the mommy who hated me and helped me with the words. His serious face assured everyone that at home there would be some guidance for this wayward kid and that they could all relax a little and quit talking capital punishment. And when it came to restitution, my dad pulled out his wallet and paid more than enough for the damage I had done. The policeman insisted that I be required to make it right with my dad. And he meant dollars, but I was thinking everything's right with my dad. I messed up, but he won't let me take the rap alone. Well, that's what God does for Israel during the divided kingdom, and he does it for you. You missed the target, you almost kill a baby. Well, not almost, you did kill a baby, and so did I, a baby that grew up to be Jesus. Standing before his accusers, then nailed to the cross. My sins nailed him to the cross, and yours. And he knows that you can't pay for a mistake this large, but he can. And so all the way he bears your shame. Since you had no sin, or since he had no sin, he could carry yours. And since he loves you, he does this, despising the shame. In fact, Hebrews 2:11 says, he is not ashamed to call us brothers. I love that. So being a remnant involves huge helpings of redemptive grace. Only grace can get us through. Now, times may test you, but you can endure, partly by knowing that when you stand alone, you aren't alone. This is clue number 4. And the first reason, obviously, God is with you. Do you love that story? I certainly do, where the king of Syria has found out that, well, every time he tries to do something against Israel, it's like the king of Israel knows where he's going to go. And then somebody reports and they say, well, you know, there's this guy Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha, and he knows everything you say in your bedroom. And he's thinking, oh, then I'm going to get rid of him. So he comes to where Elisha is. You know, this is 2 Kings chapter 6. Sends a substantial army to capture this holy eavesdropper. And Elisha's servant is terrified when he sees this. And you could be like that. You're part of the remnant, and you see everything's coming against you. It looks like our whole nation's falling apart. Stuff's going on, pressures here and there. And Elisha looks out, and he says, you know, you should be calm because... And he tells him this, and it had to sound really stupid to the servant. Those with us are more than those who are with them. And he's looking around and says, I think it's just you and me, Elisha. And then Elisha prays. He said, Lord, would you help my servant see what's really there? And the Lord answers that prayer, and that servant looks out, and there's an invisible army of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha's place. And there's no way anybody could ever hurt Elisha because of God's protection. So that's the first reason why we're not alone. But the other one is, I think, a big part of this whole message of remnant. You are not alone because there are always others who have not caved in to the sin of that day, of our day. Now, there's Elijah sighing in his cave, depressed and suicidal. He's humming, probably the first one that wrote the song, and nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And he said, I'm the only one left in Israel. And then he finds out from God, no, there's 7,000. Probably a symbolic number of a complete number of God's chosen people. 7,000 is not many in a nation of millions, but he's hardly alone. And that's supposed to encourage him. There's a remnant. Well, our times are hard. And we can feel like, man, there's not many of us. And things could get worse. Actually, things could get far worse than they are today. And I don't think just morally. Because with moral decay comes also economic and political decline. And I know what I'm going to say right now is going to sound a little depressing, sort of like a depressing science fiction plot, but the day may come when we've got no electricity or water. No running water. This is just a what if. I'm no predictor, but what if it happened? Imagine neighborhoods gray and streets unswept, sort of like the world has faded into a black and white movie. Unrepaired cars sit on the sides of streets, parts unavailable, gasoline too expensive. You can't remember the last time you rode in a car. Lawns are uncut because lawnmowers need precious gas, and no one waters anymore. City parks are neglected, and so they just kind of return to the wild. The homeless have taken over Point Defiance. The zoo animals have turned into stew. Artistic endeavors have stopped because everyone is too busy scratching out a living. You pass people on the sidewalks, and their heads are down. They're rushing to grab an extra dollar or else hawking some small items that no one wants. Brief smiles are edged with concern. The perpetual burden lies especially on the mothers. Nearly everyone is wearing hand-me-downs with run-down heels and wrong-sized shoes. Good jobs have disappeared. Only 10% are working at regular jobs, and they often don't get paid regularly, so there's not enough to both feed the family and pay the rent at the same time. Your food is always the cheapest and the same. Meat's a rare treat, maybe spam or spindly frog legs taken from the pond. Someone wrote you a note that one of their neighbors in Puyallup is trying to give their infant away because they can't feed them. You've watched as girls from good families are selling themselves and have forced themselves not to feel guilty. It's an emergency. The government is a joke because there's no revenues. Those who hold office exist by accepting bribes, and bureaucracy has sunk to lows of inefficiency because of corruption and nepotism and, lack of people of character. It takes a year to get a copy of your birth certificate at a cost you can't afford anyway. Healthcare has deteriorated, and along with available medicines, and it's depressing. And not one person you know has enough means to retire. And there are constant rumors of civil unrest. You can imagine. Now, if all this were to happen, this is just a what if, what would happen to you? What would happen to your faith in a situation? Would you decide, well, yes, there is still enough to believe there is good news? You have to decide whether it's worth talking to people about Jesus when all you can offer are intangible blessings and have a great eternity, or whether you yourself believe in a good God anymore. Now, I know this does not resemble the America you know, but it describes exactly how things have been in Liberia, where I have gone for 19 years. I just described Liberian life. And there you meet people, God's remnant, who have never lost their song, never given up their faith, never stopped dancing with joy. Your brothers and sisters in Liberia have done this already. It is not too much to bear. You're not alone. There's a remnant that can tell you you can stand in a time that has just gone to pot. Now, one last clue that I'd leave you with, and I'm not even going to expand on this, but in many ways it is the most important. Clue number 5, and it's the most obvious thing from the divided kingdom, and it's easy to miss. The promise or failure of the kingdom is completely tied in with the character of each king. God treats the nation as a whole as if they were all of the same heart as that king. And I will tell you, that is the best news you ever heard, because this is just how God does it. And if your king is Jesus Christ, this is what I'm telling you, then God treats you as if you had all the character and the credentials of Jesus, his beloved, obedient, amazing son. If this is your king, you're going to be okay. It doesn't matter. You don't even need 7,000 others. You can stand strong with God as long as your king is Jesus. Is he your king? Let's pray. Lord, it is our purpose in gathering here that we would make every effort to look in our own souls, and in some ways imagining ourselves living way back then, going through over 300 years again of ups and downs, many times just moral chaos. And yet you gave strength to many people to stand firm during those times. Some of those kings stood up for you and did a job with their nation that was an honor to you. I pray that each of us will do this in our own families, in this church, in our world. Help us to stand like prophets. At the risk of being sawn in two, maybe, help us to get a holy passion to stand for you even if no one else does. Fill our young people who are listening today with that kind of holy resolve. This is the life I want, that I will be among the sons of the prophets who will take your word around this world, who will stand up in whatever little corner they are in right now, in a school where your name is not honored and your word is never read. They will carry their Bible and carry Jesus in their heart and find you are there with those who stand for you. We take courage that many others have already done this. We pray for our brothers and sisters in Liberia who are now, even now, going through added trials of the Ebola outbreak. They live under great pressure economically and as far as their health, and then morally. Give them endurance, and then help us to take courage from them that you are sufficient in times like these. Thank you in Jesus' name.